Sorry I can't be with you this weekend. I am in Colorado. I am visiting my friend who is taking their first vows as a religious brother. Pause the video and say a prayer for Brother Nathaniel, that God blesses him in his life and that he is able to experience the joy of what it means to commit your life to Jesus. Yee, let's go. We're going on a journey. Alrighty, so basically, the Shroud of Turin is believed to be the burial cloth of Jesus. A shroud, it's just this big piece of linen. Put it on the screen. It is what they wrapped the crucified body of Jesus in after he was taken down from the cross. So as you can see, there's a pattern of blood that's all over the shroud, and that's because folded around, so it's the same splotch, just in a couple different spots. Let's take a closer look. If you see right around here, maybe, you see a very faint impression of his face. And we'll get back to that. You're probably wondering, what's Turin? Great question. Turin is a city in Italy. Next question. Okay. Shroud of Turin is a relic that is kept in Turin, Italy. It is believed to be the burial cloth of Jesus. And the story goes that in the 1300s, a guy shows up and he says that he is the burial cloth of Jesus. But the interesting thing is there's no record that this cloth was in the hands of anyone super important or that it really came from somewhere. And what's important to note is at this time in medieval Europe, there were people, some sketchy people, that had a side business, a little side hustle of recreating relics. They would pretend that this little chip of bone came from St. Peter, that this right here is part of the wood from the cross. They would fake that they had little pieces of important Catholic history and events and saints and use them as tourist attractions. They'd be like, yo, medieval peasants, come over to our church. We have a shred of Barry's veil. Isn't that so interesting? And people were like, yeah, that is interesting. And then they visited their churches and then they spent money at their taverns and tourism was booming. So when this guy in the random 1300s said he had the burial cloth of Jesus, there were some people that were like, that sounds kind of fake. Fake news. There were people that believed and there were people that were like, not so sure. The Pope at the time said, it's probably not. And then some time goes by. Let's jump all the way to the 1980s. In the 1980s, some scientists did some tests on the shroud to see if it was a fake because people thought maybe the image of his face, which is very faint, was painted on. People thought that it was just someone in the 1300s who wanted to make a fake relic. Some people in the lab did some tests and they carbon dated the linen fabric, which is a scientific way of testing the carbon-14, how it decays over time, and they can give you a rough estimate of when an item came into existence. And then lo and behold, the carbon dating said that it was from the 1300s. What? So you're probably like, Catherine, why are we talking about a medieval fake? So why are we talking about it? So glad you asked. We're talking about it because that is not the end of the story. We did more tests. And the tests show very interesting things, really exciting and cool things that I want to share with you. And we have good reason to believe that this really is the burial cloth of Jesus. Annie, do you have anything to say about the Shroud of Turin? No. So basically we learned that the image is about 1 micron thick, and that means that there's no earthly way that this image could be imprinted on the fabric. It's not painted on, it's not ink, it's not burned. Any of those things would have a thicker layer of paint or ash or something that makes it there. It's the thinnest possible image that it could be, and the image is in reverse. It's like one of those true crime memes. She lived a perfectly happy life until she didn't. How do you know this? It's so faint. What do you mean? How can you tell? They did photography on it and they saw that when they reversed it, the image became so much more crisp, so much more clear as a face. I'm going to take it to Past Kathy for a little science experiment for you. This was horribly unpleasant, so I hope you enjoy it. It's me, example Catherine. So, what's so astounding about the Shroud of Turin is that it's a reverse image on the cloth, meaning that if you were just a normal person and your face was pressed into a piece of fabric, the image, the highlights and the shadows are different than how they appear on the Shroud of Turin. It took special photography to reverse the image to see clearly the face. So, I'm going to attempt a little science experiment to show what I mean by this. We're going to go into my fridge and grab some jam that I never use. some spiced cherry preserves. And I'm going to do a lovely little face mask for you. Why am I doing this? Because I love my middle schoolers. I know the lighting in here isn't great. I'm not a YouTuber, I'm a youth minister. Think about that. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. This is a freaking war zone. Let's just pretend it's skincare. For the Lord. I'm doing it for the Lord. Oh my gosh. This smells strong. Spiced cherry. It smells like fall. Like there's cloves in here. So, basically, I'm going to press this into my face and we're going to see the imprint that it leaves behind. And okay. Yeah, I mean, it looks about like a burial cloth. We're going to the bathroom to clean my face. I love my job. This is great. So I don't know if you can tell from this lovely little face. Oh, it looks like blood. We're not going to talk about it. But it does not look like a face. You can oh wait, this is upside down, I think. Yeah, no, I don't even remember. You can kind of see my nose and you can kind of see my mouth, but it does not look anything like the crisp image of Jesus in the Shroud of Turin. And I pressed it up against my face and I was trying to get a good imprint. Jesus was just wrapped with the burial cloth. It wasn't like Mary Magdalene and Joseph of Arimathea were trying to get a portrait perfect image of Jesus's face on his burial cloth. He was just died and tortured. It would have been much more likely that it looked a little something like this. And scientists, they agree that there's no way that the human body could leave such a mark or residue. And you might be like, okay, so how'd the image get there? If it wasn't painted on, if it wasn't burned on, you kind of glimpsed over that. Scientific people in labs and things, you know, where they reside, they were hypothesizing how could the image appear on the linen? What put it there? And they said that in order for an image that thin and that clear, in a reverse image to appear on the cloth, it would have had to have been from an extreme burst of light, an extreme act of UV radiation that is so powerful it could not be recreated even in laboratories today. They have tried to recreate the image on the shroud and they are not able to get an image similar to the face on this cloth. An extreme burst of light is what made the image appear on this burial cloud. What does that sound like? Catholic scientists, people who have studied this, believe that that is the exact moment of Jesus' resurrection. The moment that from heaven, he exploded into light and rose again, which is insane. And there are people who thought it was a fake. Don't eat that. My dog's trying to eat my jam face. Why? I wonder why. So there have been a number of scientists that have studied the shroud in order to prove that it's a fake. They have never been convinced that it's real, and through looking at it and finding all of the inexplicable, mysterious things about it, have converted and become Catholic. People that were once atheists and said this is a whole bunch of religious mumbo jumbo, now practicing Catholics because of the evidence they see in the shroud. So, you might be wondering, what about that time that the people did the carbon dating and it said the shroud was from the 1300s? That feels like pretty condemning evidence that it's not the burial cloth of Jesus. Well, wouldn't you just believe that the Shroud of Turin was caught in a fire in the 1300s? No one knows how that fire happened, but it was stuck in a building that caught on fire, kind of like when Notre Dame caught on fire. Do you guys remember that? That was crazy. But the shroud got caught in a fire, and at the edges of it, there are some scorch marks. They did some repairs. They added extra linen to the corner that was burned, and that is the piece that they took the carbon dating from. So they took it from the repair. When the other scientists later looked at it and analyzed and did all their tests, they took it more from the middle, closer to where the face of Jesus was. And when did they carbon date it to? That's right, baby! About 0 AD. The time of Jesus. So now we have a shroud that came from linen that is from the time of Jesus. They also did studies looking at some of the debris and things on the shroud, and they found pollen. And where was the pollen from? It was like 14 rare species that only come from one place in the world. And where is that? Jerusalem. Oh, it's crazy, guys. So they found out that the shroud is indeed old enough to be the actual burial cloth, that it comes from Jerusalem, that this image is miraculous. radiated on by light. And then they looked at the blood. The blood type, you can see very clearly that there's a side wound from Jesus's body, and we know that from the Gospels, that's where he was stabbed. You can see clearly kind of on his head where the crown of thorns would have been. You can see the specific wounds described by the Gospel, but that's not the important part. What type of blood do you think they found on the Shroud of Turin? I will put the answers on screen and just let you guess. I don't know if you remembered, but AB blood, it's the rarest blood type in the world. And why is this interesting? Why is this exciting? It's because it's the same blood type from those Eucharistic miracles that we had talked about earlier in the year. Those very few and miraculous times when a Eucharist transformed into flesh or started bleeding, and they did the blood test in the labs, and they found things like the blood is from a Middle Eastern man, it's type AB, the subject was tortured, all those incredible things. The same blood was found on the Shroud of Turin. So what do we have here? We have a really beautiful story of what looked like, by all accounts, should have just been a fake somebody made to try and get people to visit their medieval church. But when looking at it with 21st century science, they found a bunch of things that they couldn't explain by historical accounts alone. There is not, to this day, any explanation for how Jesus's image could be on this piece of cloth. What's interesting is the church still doesn't have a definitive teaching. Pope Francis doesn't say this is the burial cloth of Jesus. So it's still something that you can choose to believe, just like how you can choose to believe Eucharistic miracles. You don't have to believe it. But for me personally, I think it is an extremely encouraging and exciting fact and piece of history about our Catholic faith that affirms the reality of Jesus' resurrection, that says that Jesus was a person who died, and we have reason to believe that miraculously, with a burst of light, he came back from the dead, and that he is somebody worth believing in. He is somebody worth learning about. He is somebody worth editing a YouTube video about. But he is worth it because he's real and he's true. He wants everybody in this world to know that and to know his love for you. Lent is really all about God saying, I am here. See me. Hear my story. Hear my story. That's what we do when we pray Stations of the Cross. It's what we do when we hear the Gospels at Mass. On Palm Sunday, we go through the crucifixion. We witness his story. Why? Because he loves us, but because it is our story. It is the story of how we get a chance to finally be happy and satisfied and reunited with the God we want so much. It is by listening to the story that we get a roadmap of how we can go to heaven. Alrighty, I hope you enjoyed this slightly chaotic retelling of the Shroud of Turin. I'm going to leave this video up on a YouTube channel so you can revisit it at any time. Hopefully you enjoyed me putting jam all over my face. It was a time and a half. That's my dog. And with that, we'll end it here. And that's really something that's like a worthwhile question to ask, right? We always talk about how God is loving, how he's all powerful, and how he's all knowing. So if God knows everything, has the power to do whatever he wants, and he's good, why doesn't he use his power to get rid of all the evil that he knows about? Why does he let it exist? So when we're talking about suffering in the world, I think it's important to separate it into two different categories. There is evil in the world that is caused by people. That's category number one. If somebody insults you and hurts your feelings, if they attack you, if they rob you, that's going to cause you suffering. A lot of really big evil things have happened because of others. Think wars, the Holocaust, crime. You know, a lot of that, it's person versus person. And that happens because people are free. God decided that it is better that people be free than to be slaves or to be forced to do something. And why is that? I mean, obviously being a slave sounds bad, so that's our very first hint. But he does that because we have to be free in order to choose love. If you are forced to love someone, if you are in a hostage situation and there is a gun to you and they say, you have to love me, do you love that person, or are you doing it because you have to? God thought it was a supreme good that we have the freedom to choose to to love him or not. And by having that freedom to choose, some people are inevitably going to choose not to love him. And that means they can choose evil. Free will means that evil can exist. Okay, that one's easy enough. I think that we've talked about that before in class. So what's the other type of evil that exists in the world? That would be the evil that is caused by natural disasters, sickness, death. Things that are not directly caused by other people. We often talk about this evil kind of like a Pandora's box situation. Adam and Eve ate the apple, and then all of these evil things kind of exploded into the world, and now they exist. And on one hand, that's kind of true. It's a very mythological way of going about things. It tells a story that reflects a reality. It's very kind of like a folk tale way of understanding. But I think we can also look at the existence of natural evils from a more logical, reasoning perspective as well. All right, so for the example of natural disasters, we know that hurricanes happen because there are cold winds and there are warm winds and there's rain and there's energy and it builds up and creates a more violent thing that can wreak havoc. God does not relish when people die in earthquakes, when their homes are destroyed by hurricanes. Those are obviously evil things. But let's break it down. When you're playing sports on a summer day, we relish when a cool breeze comes in. If you are a farmer, you need rain for your crops. There are certain natural processes that are good in and of themselves, but in certain circumstances, they can build and get an energy that makes them no longer good, but violent. And they're just following laws of physics. They're just following the science that makes them exist in the first place. And that's not an evil thing, to obey the laws of physics in your creation. Similarly with diseases, we know about biology, evolution, mutation. They evolved from something, God didn't stop it from happening. I think we can talk about these other evils by understanding that God created the wonders and the hugeness of the cosmos down to the tiniest little molecules, and those things exist with rules in place of how they interact with one another. So sometimes God doesn't interfere with the laws of nature to prevent evil things from happening, just like how he doesn't interfere with free will to stop people from doing bad things. So in both examples, God creates good things. Free will is good. The laws of nature are good. And he does not want to cease those good things by interfering to stop an evil thing from occurring. It doesn't mean that God isn't still good though. Even though God has a hands-off way of interacting with our world, he doesn't often use miracles to stop the laws of physics. Although he can, he seems far away because he's not physically interacting. He is with us in a closer and more real way, in a spiritual way, and in a way of love. Alrighty, so the next thing I want to talk about is how is suffering related to love? And before the fall, it wasn't. Simple answer. God is love. He existed in heaven in perfect happiness with himself, with the angels, and love did not involve any sort of pain, any sort of work, any sort of suffering. It was just a happy feeling in a happy place. But Adam and Eve, they sinned, and now we live in a world where we're not perfectly happy all the time. And in a world where we're not perfectly happy all the time, love now takes a certain amount of work. Think about when your best friend is in a bad mood. They're harder to love when they are cranky or annoying. So as a result of the fall, there's a natural connection between love and suffering. In order to truly love someone, you need to love them when it's difficult, when it's not just a feeling and it's easy, but when you don't feel like loving them and it's not easy, you still choose to love. So the fall established a relationship between love and suffering. But then something else happens that changes that relationship even more. Jesus died on the cross. Love went to the very heart of suffering and transformed it. Jesus made it so that suffering is not just something we have to get through in this life, but something that can be filled with a conquering power. And if that sounds like religious mumbo jumbo, let me explain a little bit. It was by Jesus entering into suffering, something that he never experienced, something he never had to experience in heaven. God knew of suffering, he is all-knowing, but he never experienced in a bodily way what it is to suffer. He enters into this. And when God and suffering enter into a room, who do you think is going to win? So when Jesus suffered on the cross for us, he won for us our salvation. Let's unpack that. So God took something that was no good, with that which was evil, and he made it the avenue with which he achieved the greatest good in the world. And so that's all well and fine. God can do anything, but St. Paul says that when we enter into suffering, God can transform that into a good. in the exact same way that he did on the cross. So basically, when Jesus died on the cross and was able to bring a good about from suffering, St. Paul, inspired by the Holy Spirit, tells us that we can bring about good from our own sufferings, that Jesus made suffering redemptive. And so we believe in this concept called redemptive suffering. And all that means is if God was able to take something that was evil, the suffering that he experienced on the cross, and bring about something that was good, we can do the same in our own lives by making our sufferings one with Jesus on the cross, by offering them up to God. Just like how Jesus offered himself up to God on the cross, when we experience pain, we can say, God, this thing is bad, this is a pain, it is not good in itself, but you can take it and transform it and bring about a good, just as you did for Jesus. Suffering is now redemptive. And last but not least, why would we optionally choose to enter into suffering like when we fast? We can kind of look at the last question to get our answer. Essentially, there are two reasons why we would optionally enter into suffering. The first one is that because suffering is related to love, because there's not only an earthly connection but a supernatural one, we are able to make an expression of love when we optionally choose to go without. When we sacrifice and deny and we feel the hunger or the annoyance born from fasting, it's a real suffering that expresses to God that I love you not only when it's easy, not only when it makes me feel happy or good, but I love you even when things are difficult. And in this first point, it's not only just a metaphor of I love you when it's difficult, because we believe in redemptive suffering and that suffering has power. When we enter into a suffering, we believe that God can bring about extra goodness, that he can do good things from the suffering we present him. And we don't want to go crazy with this. In the medieval times, people used to really hurt themselves and suffer in order to please God. And we need to remember that suffering in and of itself is not a good thing. God does not want you to hurt yourself, but going hungry and minorly entering into small sufferings can be a way that we give God something to work with, so to speak. That sounds bad because he's all powerful, but we give him something of our suffering so he can transform it into something good. God can do anything. We know he's all powerful, but in the scriptures, God tells us he still wants us to pray. He still wants us to fast, that these things still can bring about good works, even if he's all powerful. Both can be true. And the second reason that we fast is the byproduct of it, which is the growth in discipline and self-denial and perseverance and patience that fasting gives us. Fasting not only gives God a gift that he can transform into something good, it transforms us into stronger, better Christians.